I want to touch upon two things. So one, I want to talk a little bit about tax rates, and two, I want to talk about the deficit and how we can deal with that and sort of talk about decision making around that. So why do I feel like we're missing our fund balance page? There it is. So on the packet page 28, I gave you a little bit of a scenario on tax rate, sort of similar to what we looked at the last meeting, but different parameters this time. So just to fill you in on information that we do have from the state. So we do have our penalty threshold number, which has moved up to $18,789. So that we got from Brad on December 2nd. We also received the commissioner's property yield recommendation at this point in time, which is $10,763. So unfortunately, that's down from last year. So that's not the best case scenario, but of course, you know that number is not finalized until the spring. So we'll use it in making projections for now and for presenting to the taxpayers, but it's not likely to be the final number that we work with. The other thing I want to point out is the equalized pupils numbers. That's still an estimate. It's the same number you saw at the last meeting. We still don't have any numbers from the state yet. We're currently in the process of submitting ADM, and we hope to have something finalized on that soon, but at a minimum by the next meeting. So walking you through these scenarios, let me point out one other thing. So we have now calculated the amount of money we hope to draw from the CRF grants. We have plenty of attestations back from families who told us that they moved to Winhall due to the pandemic. We have documentation supporting the fact that we have paid our first half semester tuition for the number of students that we've exceeded our budgeted FTE. And that was specifically what we were told from the feds we could include. So we have everything ready to go, and I will include that in our reimbursement request to the state. It was already included in our application, so we shouldn't have any problem getting that money for Winhall. So I've included that in our expected revenues. So that sort of offsets that big deficit that we were expecting, basically cutting it almost in half. Okay. So we no longer need to worry about that as an in and out on the projection page, because now that we're another month in, we've sort of assured that we're going to get those funds. So the scenarios that I'm showing you, really, it's just playing around with, do we use our reserves, right? We have that tax stabilization reserve available to us. And what do we want to think about with respect to putting additional students in the budget? Because if we're in penalty, every new student we put in the budget is going to cost us twice, right, in the tax rate, because once we exceed that threshold, that amount of money over ed spending per pupil gets added in. So in scenario A, I'm showing what would happen if we didn't use any of our reserves and we included our 15 students like we do on an annual basis. And that shows a tax rate going up by about 40 cents. And of course, we are in penalty. If on scenario B, I'm showing that we continue to include those students, but use all of our reserves, what would that look like? And that basically cuts that tax rate in half, because we have a couple $100,000 in reserves to draw from, and the tax rate increase, in half. And we're at about 197. So in scenario 3 on column C, I'm saying we do neither of those things. We don't include the additional 15 students, and we don't use any of our reserves. What does that look like? So that brings us to a tax increase of 17 cents. Keep in mind, I'm not recommending we do any of these things. I'm just showing you what it might look like in a tax rate, okay? Lots of conversation we can have about that. And in the fourth scenario in column D, we do go ahead and use all our reserves, but we don't budget any additional students. And that's a nice tax rate, 2-cent increase. Basically what we're doing is we're compensating for what our current student population looks like, not having that second year of ADM averaged in for equalized pupils, right? Because we don't get that in that first year, but we take that 200,000 and we put it all in, and that takes us out of penalty and gives us a significantly lower tax rate increase. So that's sort of best case scenario, but also something you guys have to seriously talk about, because we can all agree that we would expect new students to move in right next year, right? That's what we see every year. So we want to talk about maybe perhaps thinking about not budgeting the full 15 and meeting somewhere in the middle, somewhere that can keep us out of penalty and perhaps not use up all of our tax stabilization one year. So I think that those are probably the numbers that we can play with as we think about, as we get closer to nailing down what a tax rate might look like in January. So that was the first thing I wanted to share with you. The second thing I wanted to talk about was packet page 30, which shows our deficit. Okay. So under statute, we have to do something about a deficit when it exists. We have to do something about the deficit that we know. So we know that in FY20, we landed with a $16,000 deficit, and we have to do something with that. So typically what we would do is we would roll that into the next budget year, and we would just raise it in ed spending. Given the scenarios that we're looking at with going into penalty, we may not want to do that. What we typically do as an organization is we look at not only where did we end up last year, but what does it look like this year? Where are we going to land at the end of this year? And we typically roll that deficit or a surplus, if available, into our projections for FY22, if we can, if it's convenient, if it works, if it doesn't impact the tax rate negatively, that's something we would do so that we can take care of business right away and not postpone it. In this case, we're dealing with a large deficit and going into a tax year where we could be in penalty when we calculate next year's tax rate. So we have to consider whether or not we want to do anything about that deficit now. We have the option of borrowing money and paying that out over 3 years. The statute that requires us to do something about that deficit also tells us what we can do about it. We can raise it in the budget. We can, the board can on their own take out a long-term note to cover those funds and spread out payments, or we can go to the voters and ask to have a 3-year note, pay that back over 3 years. The voters approve that, and we wouldn't have to start paying that back until FY23. So we wouldn't have to include any of those funds in paying back that deficit next year. We wouldn't have to include it in next year's tax rate. Last meeting, I had told you I was going to touch base with the attorney, talk about these scenarios, get some language from him. We've done all that. He's given me language for a warning. He's comfortable that we would not have to begin our first payment until FY23, as long as we don't borrow until FY22, because you have 3 years to pay it back. So our first payment should be in FY23, which it all makes sense because we wouldn't be able to borrow until the beginning of FY22 because we won't know what the true deficit is going to be until we end the year. So I'm not ready to make a recommendation to you right now that's what I'd like to see in the warning, or that's what I'd suggest you put in the warning. I think we should talk about your comfort level about going to the voters, whether or not you think it's appropriate to go to the voters versus doing a note on your own, whether or not you want to postpone doing anything about the deficit right now. Legally, you don't have to do something about a projected deficit. We only have to do something about the FY20 deficit. So those are the two things I wanted to go over with you, and I'm sure there's lots of questions. So go ahead and shoot.